Hello guys and welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah Birch and I hope you are all having an amazing day so far. I'm just going to jump right into it today because a few of you guys commented that you don't like long intros and I heard you, so let's just get right into the case. So I have wanted to learn more about this particular story since I moved to Victoria, BC on Vancouver Island in September of 2021, and that's actually where I got this perfect creature behind me, Miss Darla. But I had an amazing time living there. I unfortunately only lived there for about 8 months, and due to some unforeseen circumstances, I had to move home. But the time I spent there was so incredible. It is such a beautiful city, such a beautiful island. So I was actually driving along the road one time, passing the water, passing the gorge, and my best friend, who also lives in Victoria, was like, "Oh, that's where that girl was murdered." And I'm like, "What?" I couldn't believe I'd never heard that story because obviously, as you know, I'm a true crime fan. And Victoria is just, to me, like from what I remember, just such a beautiful, safe, calm, like hipster city. I would have never imagined a murder happening there, let alone such a gruesome murder. But I ended up leaving and moving back home. But then this little show came out, this mini series on Hulu called Under the Bridge. And I'm sure many of you have watched it or you've heard of it. It is starring Riley Keough and Lily Gladstone. And it basically tells the story of Reena Virk, who was the 14-year-old girl who was murdered in Victoria, BC in 1997. It's based on the novel under the same name that was written by Rebecca Godfrey, who is a Victoria native and author. And she's involved in this story as well. So there's lots of different people involved in this story. I watched the entire show. I thought it was very well done, very touching, but they are the first to admit that they did change some things for the sake of dramatic effect, and that they didn't fully tell the story in the way that it happened, but more so wanted to tell the story with certain narratives at the forefront in order to make more of a statement and reach more of a modern audience. Let's start by getting to know the victim in this case, Reena Virk. She was born on March 10th, 1983 in Saanich, British Columbia. So just for clarification, Victoria is the capital of British Columbia, and Victoria is the biggest city within Vancouver Island. And Saanich is sort of like a district within Victoria. So it's like its own kind of separate neighborhood or separate suburb, if that makes sense. So this case mostly will be taking place in Saanich, but if it makes more sense for you, you can also just imagine Victoria. Her parents were Manjit and Suman Virk. Manjit was an immigrant who moved to Canada to be with Suman and start a new life in British Columbia, but he was originally from India, whereas Suman actually was born in Victoria herself, but her parents were immigrants and they came to the country in 1951. When they arrived on the island, they didn't really know anybody, and the first people to greet them and sort of bring them into the Victoria community were actually people from the Jehovah's Witness religion. So having been surrounded by these people who were Jehovah's Witness, Suman's parents actually converted to the Jehovah's Witness religion once they arrived in Canada, and then they brought up Suman under that same religion as well. So when Suman wanted to marry Manjit, Manjit actually converted to Jehovah's Witness to be with his new wife, and they started a life together. They lived in Victoria, or in Saanich, and they had 3 children, and Reena was the oldest of the 3 kids. She had a younger brother and a younger sister. Reena's family is considered to be a minority within a minority because not only are they part of the South Asian community within British Columbia, which I lived there, Victoria, British Columbia in general, is predominantly white population. So they were within the South Asian community, which made them slightly ostracized or possibly largely ostracized. I can't speak for their experience, but they definitely were a minority in that sense. And then they were also Jehovah's Witness, which also made them a minority as well. So they were going to face prejudice from people around them and people in their community on multiple different fronts, if that makes sense. As a child, Reena was said to be a happy, energetic, vibrant young girl. She loved animals in particular, and she also really loved music. And as she grew into her teen years, she began to develop a huge love for rap music. She also started wearing kind of more baggy street-style clothing to emulate the sort of rap culture that was really prominent in the 1990s. And she started painting her nails blue and, talking back to her parents and breaking curfew and running away and all those typical things that you might consider a red flag or a warning sign that your teen is heading down a dark path. And what was spurring a lot of this rebellion from Reena was that she was hanging out, or trying to hang out, with a group of girls at school called the Shoreline Six, who were like the popular cool girls, the party girls. Keep in mind, these people are all like 13, 14, they're in middle school. But she really wanted to get in with this crowd. She admired them, she admired their freedom and their attitude and their sass, and she was desperate to become part of this group and to be accepted by these peers. Reena really struggled with insecurities and feeling self-conscious, not only about her race and her parents' identity as Jehovah's Witness, because a lot of people wouldn't understand that, it would make fun of her about that, but also the fact that she had more body hair than some of her peers because of her South Asian heritage. And I don't think she was, based on the few photos I've seen, but she was considered to be overweight, or at least she saw herself as overweight. Keep in mind, the beauty standards of the 1990s in terms of weight were insanity. Like, we're talking, this is the era of heroin chic, right? So they would call her fatty, they'd make fun of her body hair, and by they, I'm talking about like her school peers and her so-called friends. Although Reena kind of kept like a tough girl, still fun, still energetic, she tried to keep this bravado going and this energy going at school and not let people know how much she was hurting or how much their words were affecting her. Clearly, their words did have a profound effect on her, and a lot of this insecurity and emotion would boil up at home in like her private sphere, and she would kind of lash out at her parents. Words hurt, and especially when you are 13, 14, like that is the depths of misery. Like, you could not pay me enough money to go back to being 14 years old, especially as a girl. You're going through puberty, everything hurts, everything feels weird, you're comparing yourself to all the other girls at school, and this girl has bigger boobs and this girl has a boyfriend, and it is the trenches. And I can only imagine going through that as a minority and being bullied by these little bitches at school. So in an attempt to both kind of rebel from her parents' rules and regulations, which were completely normal. I mean, she had a curfew of 9 o'clock, which I think is completely fair for a 13-year-old. You know, she was expected to go to church with her parents, and she was expected to just, you know, respect her parents, not talk back, all that stuff, which I think is completely fair. But of course, Reena is not looking at this as like a rational person. She's looking at this as an upset, bullied 13-year-old girl, and she thinks her parents are out to get her, and she's blaming a lot of her unhappiness on her parents, and she wants more freedom, and she thinks her life would be much better if she was in a different family and had more freedom like all these other girls. So in an attempt to sort of fit in with them and mold herself into the group, she started smoking marijuana and cigarettes, and also drinking a little bit and trying to go to these parties that all these other kids were at. Keep in mind, these other children that she was kind of comparing her own life to and wanting their life, these kids were mostly in group homes, in foster care, or straight up just homeless, bouncing from couch to couch. I don't think Reena, because she was still a child herself, had like the full perspective to be able to see their lives in comparison to hers in a true way and realize that she actually was so much better off than these children and had so much more to be grateful for than these children, because she had loving and attentive parents, because she had structure and she had routine. But, you know, she didn't see it that way because she was a kid, and she saw these other kids who had no curfew and nobody looking after them, and they could run around the streets and talk to whoever they wanted to and smoke whatever they wanted to, and she envied that, and she wanted that freedom for herself, which I think is very common for people around this age. But it just saddens me that Reena didn't recognize what she had when she had it in terms of a stable, loving family. And I'm sure so many of those other kids, whether they'd admit it or not, they would have given anything to have two parents who were looking after them and checking in on them and wanting more for them. So Reena wanted to get out of the family home. She felt, like I said, she felt like her parents were to blame for everything that was going wrong in her life. So her rebellious attitude kind of spiraled out of control, and in 1996, she actually went to police and claimed that her family had been emotionally abusing her. So as a reaction to this, they temporarily took her out of the family home with her mom and dad, and they got her to live with her maternal grandparents for a while, and she wasn't very happy with this situation either. And apparently, I heard through multiple sources that it was at her grandparents' house where she did attempt to unalive herself. That just goes to show how deep her misery and how deep her frustration was, that at only 13 years old, she was attempting to unalive herself. She wasn't happy at her grandparents' house either. She wasn't happy with her mom and dad. She needed to take this to the next level. So with the encouragement of these girls in the Shoreline Six, who most of them lived in a group home together, they encouraged her to make another false report, this time amp it up a little bit so that she would actually get taken away and put into foster care. So Reena falsely reported that her father Manjeet had been sexually molesting and assaulting her, and without any proof, any evidence, they didn't question him, they didn't question her. She refused to let them search her body for bruises. She couldn't really answer any of their questions. They just grabbed Manjeet and arrested him on the spot, which is not proper protocol in these type of situations. You're supposed to do at least a small investigation or have some evidence of proof before you just go arresting someone at their family home in front of all their neighbors. Reena got what she wanted. Reena was placed into the Canadian Ministry of Families and Children, and she was put into the local sort of foster home or group home for girls in Victoria. And this is where some of the other girls in the Shoreline Six lived as well, such as Nicole Cook, who we will get to in a minute. But just to clarify, the Shoreline Six, that name, you might be wondering what that name is. The six girls, they were like a little group, a little girl gang, and they all went to Shoreline Community Middle School, and that was also the school that Reena went to. And so they took the name of the school and they took the number of girls that were accepted or admitted into this exclusive group, and they titled themselves the Shoreline Six. So that was kind of their like girl group name. However, not long after being put in foster care and living at this group home, Reena quickly realized that it was not all it was cracked up to be, and she probably made a big mistake getting herself put there in the first place. So she admitted that she had made up the allegations about her father, and she agreed to drop the charges against him. And she was eventually put back into the family home, but there was very strict provisions and expectations and rules on her at this point, like, which I understand. I mean, I think Manjeet and Suman were extremely traumatized by this whole situation and had lost a lot of trust in their daughter. And so they were willing to work on their relationship, but they needed to take it slow and steady. And there would be still a lot of hiccups to come within the dynamics of their family. However, even though Reena eventually left the foster home, she would still eagerly be pursuing these relationships and friendships with the girls in the Shoreline Six. I can't say all their names off by heart, so I'm going to read them. Nicole Cook, she was sort of like the Regina George of the group, so to speak, like the main girl, the ringleader. Everyone followed what she said. So there was Nicole Cook, as well as Nicole Patterson, Missy Grace Play, Courtney Keith, Gail Ooms, and Kelly Marie Ellard. So the only name, and I found this very interesting, the only name they kept the same from the show versus the real story was Kelly Marie Ellard. And I think they did that for a reason. And Kelly Marie Ellard has become quite a popular name within Canadian true crime and just Canadians in general. She's probably one of the most hated women in Canada, in Canadian history. Probably right behind Karla Homolka, I would say. So I feel like the show protected the identities of all the other girls except for her. And you will see why they might have chosen to do that. These relationships were not good. They were not reciprocal. They were toxic. They were more or less one-sided. Were pretty brutal to Reena. They would tease her. They'd bully her. They'd bring her in. They'd push her out. They'd bring her in. They'd push her out. And Reena would kind of take whatever she could get from them. But there were moments when her anger and her frustration would completely boil over, and she would want to cause them pain. She'd want to embarrass them and hurt them the same way that they were doing that to her. So one night, Reena called a bunch of people at school, specifically young boys who they all knew from the community or from school, and she started spreading rumors about the ringleader, Nicole Cook. She said things like she had had an abortion, that her boobs were fake, and that she had AIDS. And these rumors circled back pretty quickly to Nicole, and she realized that it was Reena who had been spreading these rumors about her. And instead of like looking within and taking an ounce of culpability for the fact that she had been bullying Reena for months, and now obviously Reena was trying to get a little bit of revenge, instead of like seeing that as a learning lesson moment, Nicole just wanted revenge, and Nicole wanted to make Reena suffer. So now we're going to get into the actual events of the night of the murder, and the murder of Reena Virk took place on November 14th, 1997. A few of the members of the Shoreline Six called Reena up when she was at home and invited her out to a party at the Shoreline Community School. I'm assuming they were just going to be out in like the playground or the yard to drink and smoke. So Reena was thrilled that she got the invite. So she quickly grabbed her stuff and headed out the door. The party at the school got pretty rowdy pretty quickly, and police actually came to break it up. So the kids ended up migrating towards the water, and this is sort of an inlet of the ocean, so to speak, but it's called the Gorge Waterway, and over top of the Gorge Waterway is a bridge called the Craigflower Bridge. So under the bridge, the title of the show, the title of the book is referencing the Craigflower Bridge. Just so you know. So they started making their way towards the water. They were drinking, smoking. Everyone is just, they're out partying into the wee hours of the night without anyone checking in on them whatsoever. And this is when things get really bad. So Nicole and one of her little henchmen grabbed Reena. They kind of hooked elbows with her and walked her down underneath the Craigflower Bridge. They said they wanted to go have a smoke under the bridge with her. So they kind of more or less coaxed her, like pulled her down under the bridge, and a group of kids were waiting there for her. They started throwing accusations at her that she had been trying to steal their boyfriend, that she'd been making up rumors about them. And, Reena was kind of just telling them to fuck off and leave me alone. And they were cornering her and circling her. And that is when Nicole Cook took her cigarette that she was smoking and put it out right in the center of Reena's eyebrows. If you haven't already got where I'm going with this, that is where a traditional bindi would go in the Indian culture. So that's really fucked up. And that horrible, disgusting act of dehumanization, that's what kicked off the violence. All the other girls started jumping in, punching her, kicking her, pulling her hair. And even one local boy, Warren Glowatski, just jumped in out of nowhere and started kicking her as well. They were doing some very serious damage to Reena. This was not just like a little innocent play fight. This was a serious beating. And eventually one bystander who was there, who was kind of watching, they couldn't take it anymore. And they said, this is getting too serious. And they started kind of defending Reena and said, if you want to keep going on her, you're going to have to go through me and take me down too. And something about this particular act or threat kind of calmed everyone down, and everyone decided to just sort of disperse. And they left Reena in like a bloody, beaten pile on the mud underneath the bridge. So Reena's nose was bloody. Her eyes were almost swollen shut. She managed after a few minutes to kind of collect herself and pull herself up off the ground. And she stumbled her way back up kind of the hill towards the main roadway. And she was starting to walk home towards her parents' house. Reena never came home that night. And around midnight, her parents started to grow worried. They eventually got so worried when she still didn't come home that they went into the police station, the Saanich police station, and they reported her missing. Although the police there didn't take this very seriously for multiple reasons. Firstly, Reena was a ward of the state, and she was also a known runaway, so they just assumed that this was another incident of her acting out or trying to rebel. And they also said, as you will hear so often in true crime stories, especially from back in the 80s and 90s, they said that they needed to wait 48 hours to file someone as missing, which is absolute bullshit. If any police station ever tells you that, that's not a legitimate rule, especially for a child. So they waited 48 hours, and come Monday morning, rumors started to fly around school and amongst the parents of the kids that a really nasty fight had gone down with Reena Virk and some of the kids on Friday night, and people were saying that maybe Reena would never come back to school again. And when police started to hear these rumors going around and these concerns, they finally decided, I guess we should probably take this case seriously. I guess we should probably look into this. Granted, this was Monday at school, and the actual crime happened on Friday. They started asking around to some kids and some witnesses, and one witness actually did come forward and kind of said everything they knew. They explained the situation. They said Nicole and one of her friends in the Shoreline 6 brought Reena under the bridge where other kids were waiting for her. There was some words shared, and they all started beating on her and attacking her and kicking her. Someone jumped in, broke up the fight, and everyone went separate ways. And that's pretty much all that this witness could say. This is all that witness had seen. But where was Reena Virk? She apparently stumbled away from the bridge that night, but she was still nowhere to be found, and 3 days had passed. All of the 17, so this would be the Shoreline 6, as well as Warren Glowatski, who was a local boy who was involved in kind of crime and mischief within the Victoria area, they were brought in to the Juvenile Detention Center for questioning because they had been specifically picked out by the witness as the people who had beaten up Reena Virk. The scene at the Juvenile Center kind of became one of chaos. There was angry parents, confused parents, wondering why their kids had been detained. The children were starting to freak out and starting to panic and look at each other and what do we do? What do we say? They couldn't actually pin any sort of homicide on these children yet because it still wasn't confirmed whether Reena Virk was dead or alive, but they wanted to question them about that night. However, sadly, a few days later, Reena's body would be found in the Portage Inlet, floating face down in the water. This was on November 22nd, 1997, only 8 days after the incident occurred under the bridge. It was very clear from taking a few looks at the body that this was a homicide and not just a missing person case. An autopsy was done on Reena's body, and it was found that her cause of death was forcible drowning. This was an extremely violent drowning, as there was many pebbles from the gorge waterway, the surface of the water, pebbles found inside of Reena's lungs, which signified that she was trying so hard to breathe and to get up from the water that she had actually sucked a bunch of pebbles into her own lungs. The person who did the autopsy actually told police that the beatings that she had sustained were so serious and so gruesome that alone probably would have killed Reena. But who's to say if Reena would have survived even just trying to walk home? She might have just died on the side of the road because these kids beat her so badly. Victoria Police Sergeant Rob Dibdin said, and I quote, "Even as police officers, I think most of us were taken aback by the savagery of it and the absolute senselessness of it." So officers knew they had to speak more with Nicole Cook because witnesses had placed her there, and she was the one who kind of started this whole thing by putting the cigarette burn out on Reena's head. And Nicole didn't really know what to do. She didn't want to rat on her friends. She didn't want to throw anyone under the bus, but she also didn't want to have this pinned on her as well. However, another person who was involved in this, Kelly Marie Ellard, she had no issue pointing the blame right at Nicole Cook and kind of said it was Nicole and pointed the finger right at her. So when Nicole found this out, that Kelly didn't necessarily have the same loyalty that Nicole was trying to have towards Kelly, she confessed that Kelly was actually the one who had followed Reena down the road after the fight had broken up. Some evidence to back up the claim that Kelly was probably involved in the murder was that police found Reena's jacket inside of Kelly's closet, and when they examined the jacket, there were salt water stains on the jacket that were consistent with the water inside the gorge. Kelly claimed that it wasn't her jacket and she knew nothing about this, but investigators knew better than to believe that. More and more teens were coming forward and sharing what they saw, and multiple teens confessed that they had seen Kelly Marie Ellard and Warren Glowatski walk together down the road to go follow Reena Virk. I'm just going to take a slight little caveat here to briefly talk about Rebecca Godfrey, who is the author of Under the Bridge, because this is kind of the point in the story where she comes in. So Rebecca Godfrey at this point was a young writer who was born in Toronto but then grew up in Victoria and actually lived in New York City, and she was an author and a creative. And she was back in Victoria during this specific period, just visit family. And when she was home, all of this drama was ensuing within the community. She came back because she wanted to do research for a book, and she wanted to write a book specifically about the troubled youth and the troubled teens within Victoria. She had experienced her own trauma at the age of 13 when her older brother Gabe had died by drowning in the ocean. So after that point, Rebecca started really rebelling, drinking, smoking, partying, getting involved with the wrong kind of people. So Rebecca wanted to take a deeper look into why that type of trajectory was so common within Victoria specifically. And she wanted to get to know the kids on the streets, the homeless kids, the foster home kids, and interview them and see if she could put a book together to kind of bring this narrative to life. She had no idea what she was about to walk into, though, and when Rebecca went into the local juvenile detention center to try to talk to a few kids, she looked around and she saw complete chaos ensuing as parents were screaming at detectives and detectives were trying to placate the parents, and these kids were all inside separate cells. Some of the girls in the Shoreline 6 were banging on the glass and trying to get Rebecca's attention, and clearly there was something serious going on. And she actually overheard one of the officers saying, and I quote, "Yeah, we just arrested all these girls for murder." And immediately Rebecca was struck at how young these girls were and how could they have possibly committed a murder. She apparently felt in that moment in that juvenile center that there was a reason that she was there with those kids and that she needed to talk to them and she needed to hear their side of the story. She just felt this in her soul that this was her new purpose. So that's it for now with Rebecca Godfrey. I just wanted to explain how she's kind of involved in the story. Going back to the autopsy of Reena Virk, her mother actually volunteered to come and identify the body in the morgue, and her mother was absolutely devastated and sickened at the sight of the burn mark right in the center of her daughter's eyebrows. This strategic burn is one of the most hotly contested elements of this case, because Reena Virk's murder was not considered to be a hate crime. And many people, especially looking back, 30 years later, many people consider this to be a huge tragedy of Canadian justice. I don't know how you can look at something like that, a cigarette burn supposed to be imitating a bindi on a young 14-year-old girl's head who had already been made fun of for her body hair, had already been made fun of for her culture. I don't know how you can look at that and not consider it to be a hate crime, but, when police were asked about this, they just sort of said, there was lots of kids in the group who were of different ethnicities and different cultures, so there's no way it could be a hate crime, because there was some kids from an indigenous background, some kids from a black background, and then there was Reena, who was of like a South Asian background. So for some reason in the officer's head, because it was a somewhat mixing pot of different children, it couldn't have been a hate crime. And that's not like really how hate crimes work, obviously. This is like a one-dimensional, not very nuanced approach to looking at this crime and looking at this case. I'm assuming the officers just didn't want to deal with the ramifications of turning this into a hate crime and potentially the media storm that would happen from that. So they just wanted to keep it, as simple as possible. But I think this was a tragic oversight, and I know a lot of people agree with me. Like I mentioned earlier, people really did view the world differently and viewed these type of nuances very differently in the 90s than they do now. And some people don't even understand the nuance of like a hate crime now, even in 2024. Some people still don't understand how delicate these situations are. So I'm not trying to give them a pass. It's hard to view this case from a 2024 viewpoint. And I actually do want to give my applause to the creators of the show, because I do think they did a good job at really highlighting the racial narrative behind the story that kind of got swept over in the real story in 1997. Whoever did this to her didn't see her as a human being, much less love her. And that quote really hit me, because the dehumanization of Reena in this story is so sickening. And ultimately, that's what a hate crime is based in. It's based in dehumanization. It's based in just seeing someone as an enemy, but not even that, seeing someone as an animal, not seeing them as equal to you in any sense of the word. The systematic pervasiveness of like bullying and racism and sexism, those conscious or subconscious thoughts and feelings that people put out into the world or share online, or those get into other people's subconscious, and it creates this larger scale shitstorm of dehumanization towards women, towards minorities, towards immigrants, towards anyone, everyone. Like anyone can be dehumanized in one way or another, but typically there are specific groups like racial groups or women who are dehumanized on a mass scale because of this systemic, deep-rooted generational racism and misunderstanding and lack of compassion. And that's where these hate crimes stem from. That discussion was not had in 1997 when this case was so popular and everyone was talking about this case. That was a conversation that really should have been had at that time. I did want to have a little speech about that. I wanted to say my piece about that, but we're going to get back into the case. Another example of kind of dehumanization and taking bullying to the next level of actual violence and murder is the case of Shanda Sharer, which also took place in the 90s. This case took place in 1992, where 3 girls murdered and tortured their classmate Shanda Sharer, and she was only 12 or 13 years old at the time. So with that case, and then a few years later, this case, you could see why there was this sort of moral panic bubbling up within North America of like, what is going on with our young girls? What is going on with society? Where is all this anger coming from? Where is all this rage coming from? And those 2 cases in particular really shook people up, because they couldn't believe that young people were capable of this, let alone young girls. So now we're going to move into the trials and convictions. So I will probably be reading from my notes a little bit in this section, just because this is the part where things get a little complicated and I want to make sure I get all of the accurate information to you. So just bear with me if I'm looking at my notes, okay? So over the following years, Warren Glowatski and the 6 female perpetrators who were involved in the beating and murder of Reena Virk were brought to trial and individually charged. Due to the fact that they were underage, at the time of the case, the female victims were referred to by their initials. Now people do know their names, but at the time, like Nicole Cook, for example, was referred to as NC. My dog just burped so loud. I don't know if you guys could hear that on the mic, but that was a big one. So Warren Glowatski, I'm just going to get slightly into his backstory here. He was born in April of 1981 in Medicine Hat, Alberta. His mother unfortunately struggled quite a lot with alcoholism. So at some point, him and his father decided to leave her and move to British Columbia. So they originally settled in Nanaimo, which is also a city in Vancouver Island, but eventually made their way to Victoria, and they settled in a trailer park in Saanich. Before long, Warren actually fell madly in love with a young girl at his school, and her name was Sarita Hartley. They were honestly quite serious from such a young age, and she wasn't involved. Like, she was there at the party, but once she saw the chaos happening, she immediately excused herself and said, "I feel sick, I don't want to watch this," and left. So she's completely innocent in all of this. The girl, Sarita, the real woman, she's a grown woman now. She's actually all over TikTok. She's quite active on TikTok, and she actually put up this long 10-minute TikTok the other day. I did not watch the whole thing, if I'm being honest. But she breaks down the show and what was right and what was wrong, and kind of clarifies certain things for people. She does provide some insight in her TikTok for people who want to learn more, so you can check that out if you're interested. So Warren became affiliated with a local Crips gang when he moved to Victoria, and as part of his initiation, the other gang members apparently beat him up really badly, and for some reason that was his initiation into the gang. So, he was not a stranger to violence, and he was certainly surrounded by some pretty rough people. Before too long, his father actually said that he had fallen in love with a woman who lived in Southern California, and so he wanted them to move out to Southern California to be with this new woman. But Warren basically said, "I'm staying behind and I'm going to live on my own because I don't want to leave Sarita," who was his girlfriend. So his dad was kind of like, okay, sayonara, and his dad left Warren to live on his own at the young age of 16. And so Warren was kind of struggling to make ends meet, struggling to take care of himself. His father would send him the occasional checks here and there to pay for things, but his girlfriend's family would actually take care of him as well and kind of help him with his laundry, help him with meals and all of that. So in June of 1999, 16-year-old Warren Glowatski was convicted of the second-degree murder of Reena Virk and given a life sentence. It took some convincing to get Warren to testify, but eventually on trial, Warren confessed to all of it and did implicate Kelly Marie Ellard. He said that he and Kelly had followed Reena to continue the attack because apparently they were concerned that she was going to rat them out. Warren said that he was the one, they started beating on her, and when she kind of went down, Warren was the one who pulled her into the water, and Kelly was the one who held her head forcefully underwater until Reena was dead. Because he was a youth at the time of the murder, he was eligible for parole after serving 7 years, and in November of 2004, he was denied his first chance at day parole. The Virk family did not contest the parole because Glowatski expressed remorse and responsibility to them on multiple occasions. In July 2006, he was granted unescorted temporary absences from jail, and by December 2006, Glowatski was eligible to apply for day parole, and he was granted so in June 2007. So yes, Warren was extremely apologetic for what he did. I still don't fully understand where all that rage and anger came from. From what they showed in the series, he was kind of saying, I was going through a hard time, I was struggling with a lot of things, and it just felt good to release all that anger and to take it out on someone. That's just not an excuse, but he couldn't even comprehend himself why he committed this murder, and he had apologized on multiple occasions to Reena's family and took culpability for it, confessed to it, and served his sentence without complaint. So Reena Virk's family, and I give them all the props in the world for this, they were able to find some grace for him in their hearts, and they were able to advocate for his parole, which is extremely generous of them. But they weren't as generous towards Kelly Marie Ellard, because Kelly Marie Ellard handled this whole thing like a complete asshole. So now let's get a little into her crazy ass backstory. Kelly Marie Ellard was 15 years old at the time of the murder, and she was said to be the only perpetrator who didn't show any signs of remorse, any signs of guilt. She almost made a mockery of the whole thing. Even at such a young age, at 15 years old, Kelly just did not seem capable of expressing any empathy or any humanity. And multiple people said when they looked into her eyes, they just saw pure evil. And I will give mad kudos to the actress who played her in the show, because this actress did such a good job at portraying that spine-chilling, creepy, dead eye, no empathy. That actress, I was looking a little bit into her, and she doesn't have a huge background of movies yet, but I think she's going to have a big career because the way that she portrayed Kelly Marie Ellard, I think, was really, really well done. Kelly was born on August 9th, 1982, and her grandma described Kelly as a young girl, happy and content and full of life. However, when her parents divorced at the age of 8, Kelly took this very hard. Her mother remarried, and Kelly lived a pretty normal, middle-class, average life. She wasn't really hard done by any sense of the imagination, but she just seemed to have this inclination towards a rougher, darker path. She didn't want to live an easy life. It seemed like she was making every choice possible to make life harder for herself. She actively chose to hang out with a rougher crowd. She began drinking, she began smoking, and she began acting out at school. She would apparently swear at the teachers, and she got suspended twice. And she actually had a history of violence even before the crime took place with Reena Virk. 3 months before the murder, apparently Kelly and some of her friends lured a girl at school into a remote location where they started beating on her and hitting her, and apparently they tried to set her hair on fire. And then in another incident, Kelly Marie Ellard also held a knife up to a student's throat at school. So she was a lot. And she didn't really face any real consequences for either of these things. I mean, she got suspended a few times and that was about it. Kelly Marie Ellard, I get the sense from her from the show and just from my own research that she thought she was invincible and she thought she was untouchable. At trial, Kelly Ellard would not confess, but was still found guilty by the Crown, thank God, for the murder of Reena Virk. She would be in and out of the courtroom, however, for the next 10 years, and in total she stood trial 3 times for the murder and was convicted twice. Kelly was granted conditional day parole in November 2017, and in October 2018, when her parole day was extended, the documents from the Parole Board of Canada revealed that Ellard had changed her name to Carrie Marie Sim. In May 2022, the then 39-year-old Carrie Marie Sim waived her right to a parole hearing as she did not yet feel ready to return to society on a full-time basis. So Kelly Marie Ellard, or Carrie Marie Sim, whatever the hell you want to call her, she's now 41 years old and she actually has 2 children of her own. My face will tell it all. My face will say exactly how I feel about the fact that this woman has kids. Many people described Kelly before and after the murder as being sociopathic in nature. And maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but I just don't think sociopaths should have children. I really don't. And you know who else is out in the world and raising kids is Karla Homolka, so that's fun.
I'm still waiting to hear Kelly Ellard admit her guilt in taking Reena's life. It would give me a lot of satisfaction to hear her say that.
The remaining members of the Shoreline Six, so this would be Nicole Cook, Missy Pleish, Gail Ooms, Courtney Keith, and Nicole Patterson, all were found guilty for causing bodily harm, and their sentences varied from a 60-day custodial sentence to 1 year in the Victoria Juvenile Detention Center. These girls maintain that they left the bridge after the initial attack, and they believed that Reena would be okay. They wanted to hurt her and embarrass her after spreading rumors, but they didn't actually intend to kill her. However, as I mentioned earlier, the autopsy showed that Reena had suffered such severe, extreme wounds and lacerations and bruises that she probably would have died from this beating anyway had she not been drowned. So I just don't really buy the whole, we just wanted to scare her. We just wanted to, but we didn't want to kill her. I have to try to remember, this is such a tough case because they were kids. They were 14, 15-year-old kids who were from really tough backgrounds, most of them, not all of them. Someone like Kelly Marie Ellard, who was the worst of all of them, she had a pretty normal upbringing. But some of the girls like Nicole Cook or Missy, they did have unpredictable upbringings. They were displaced from place to place. They didn't have a strong mother figure in their life. I am able to find some compassion for them as children, and I can see where a lot of their rage and a lot of their frustration was coming from. I just really don't know why they had to take it out on Reena when they already had made Reena suffer every day with the way they were bullying her and ostracizing her. And as if that's not enough, they had to go and inflict this much pain and torture on her. I'm sorry, I think these kids are monsters. And you know who agrees with me is Missy. Missy was the only one of the Shoreline Six who has been vocal about this, spoken openly about this to the media and just online. And in an interview, Missy said, and I quote, "We should have gotten longer sentence. We were monsters." So if Missy's able to admit that herself, in retrospect, I have to agree with her. And I do respect her slightly for the fact that she was able to acknowledge that their sentences were absolutely bullshit. 60-day custodial sentence or 1 year in juvie for beating a person nearly to death and putting a cigarette out on their forehead. I don't think that sentence was harsh enough. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. After Reena's death, her parents were honestly so resilient. It's truly inspiring, and they would go on to promote and spearhead many anti-bullying initiatives throughout Canada. And her father, Manjit, actually wrote a book for himself, and this is called Reena, A Father's Story. And in this book, he used his voice to share his disappointment for the Canadian legal system, as well as sort of the social services system, who took Reena out of the home and arrested him without any legitimate evidence. And then he also really was quite disappointed with the legal system as well, for not only not making it a hate crime, but also not giving adequate sentences. I wish I had better news, but there are still 2 more deaths I need to quickly mention. Unfortunately, Reena Virk did pass away from choking. I don't know many details on this, but it was a choking incident while she was out to eat. And she passed away in 2018 at the young age of 58 years old. And Rebecca Godfrey, who was the author who shared Reena's story and published Under the Bridge, which became a very successful novel, she also passed away of cancer in 2022. And she had collaborated a lot on this show before it came out. She was doing her best to collaborate, but unfortunately she lost her battle to cancer. I wish her family well. I wish the Virks well. And I hope everyone who has passed away in this story can rest in peace, because it's just all so tragic. In conclusion, Reena Virk was just a kid. Like, I've been teaching 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds for years as a dance teacher. And when you actually spend time with them, and they are kids, they are fallible, they are so easily impacted, they are so moldable, they're so easily influenced. That age is so hard in so many ways as both a parent and as a child. Reena's untimely death has become a very symbolic story within Canada, and within the greater community, especially the true crime community, of how far racism and bullying can go. It doesn't always stop at words. Sometimes this type of built up pain and resentment and bullying and dehumanization can lead to things like this. And nobody wants to think about it. No one wants to consider it, especially when it comes to your own kids. But kids can be brutal. Kids can be mean, especially when they have nowhere to put their anger. They don't have a safe place to express themselves. And they don't have a fully formed brain or a fully formed frontal cortex to make logical decisions. And so I just think so many people in this case were failed and were let down on so many different levels. And if nothing else, I hope that Reena Virk's story can be used for educational purposes. I think this story should be taught in every school across Canada. I had never even heard of this story, and I'm a true crime girl, and I had never heard of this story till I went out to Victoria myself. I don't know why this story wouldn't be used as a cautionary tale, not only to keep Reena's legacy alive, but to teach children, because Canada is a country built on immigration, and it is a multicultural melting pot, especially in cities in BC, Toronto, Montreal. I think it's 100% a shame that more people don't know this story, and I am grateful to Rebecca Godfrey and to the creators of Under the Bridge for bringing the show to a larger audience and doing a good job with it. I would have been so disappointed if they didn't do a good job with the show. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Those are my feelings. Hopefully make some sort of positive contribution to one person watching this. Maybe they'll have a conversation with their kid, or maybe they'll keep their eyes out on bullying on the playground or just whatever. Hopefully, you know, a lot of people see true crime as exploitative, and I can understand that argument, but I think it can also be used for good if it's done correctly and if it's processed correctly from the viewer. So that's that, guys. That is my Reena Virk story. I truly hope her legacy lives on, and I hope her memory lives on, and I hope the different institutions in Canada and the different people in Canada as citizens can do better and will do better in the future for our children and for our youth. Because we got to look out for them. They're just babies. They're just kids. We can't let this shit happen. We can't. So that's it for me, guys. If you enjoyed this case and you want to see more, I'm going to put out an episode every week, a new story from all over the world. I'm going to cover different topics, different perspectives. So you can subscribe here and hit the notifications. You can also follow me on Instagram. Yeah, just show your support. Leave a comment. Let me know what cases you want to hear. Let me know what your thoughts are on this case. I hope you stay safe. I hope you stay well. And I really hope you stay kind. Be kind to everyone around you. You never know what people are going through. You never know what obstacles people are facing. And just be patient and be kind with people. Okay, goodbye.